This is a story about... Actually, let me let her tell you what it's about.
This is a story about control. My control.
It's 1985, and Janet Jackson is in Minneapolis working on what will become her breakthrough album. And while she's there, she's taking a dance class with this friend of hers, and after class, there's this group of men that start following her, yelling things at her, calling her baby, being sexually threatening. And Janet wants to run away. She wants to run back to the studio where her producers are, but instead she stops. She turns around and confronts them and backs them down. Then later she goes into the studio with her producers, Terry Lewis and Jimmy Jam. And she takes this negative experience she'd had with these men and turns it into an anthem about respect. And after hearing Janet's story, her producer, Jimmy Jam, comes up with an iconic line. Now my first name ain't Baby, it's Janet. Miss Jackson if you're nasty. This becomes not only an iconic line on this album and in pop culture, but the whole thing is symbolic of a new direction Janet Jackson is taking in her career and in her life. She's not backing down anymore, she's taking control. Janet Jackson hadn't wanted to start a singing career in 1982, but her father, Joseph Jackson, who was notoriously controlling and abusive, had made her. She didn't really have a say in being in the entertainment industry in the first place. As the youngest of the 9 Jackson children, she was in show business for basically as long as she could remember. Her older brothers were part of the successful group, the Jackson 5. And as a child, it was just a given that she would be part of the family business.
In the Jackson 5 family, everybody works.
Janet had a complicated relationship with music. She said she believed in music's power to heal, but also she felt an obligation as an entertainer. She was raised to believe that the audience's needs came before her own feelings. She and her siblings were taught that no matter what pain they were going through, they had to put on a smile and sing. Janet's first taste of success separate from her brothers was in 1977 when she was 10 years old and cast as Penny on the show Good Times. The character of Penny was a girl who had been abused. And not only could Janet relate to that because of her upbringing, but her time on the set was traumatic as well. Even though she was just a child, she was told that she had to lose weight. When she started going through puberty, they made her bind her breasts so she would appear more flat-chested, something that contributed to Janet's already poor self-esteem. She did like acting, but she had no say in what roles she could take. In 1982, she was cast in the show Fame, something that she didn't want to do, but her father made her. He was also her manager at this time, so she felt like she had no choice but to go along with it. Also in 1982 is when Joseph decided she should be a singer. She had been writing since she was little, short stories and poems, and she had written her first song when she was 9, but she didn't really want to be a singer. But since she was in a family of musicians and music was always around, one day she had recorded a song just for fun in the family recording studio. And her father heard it and thought that she had potential. She said, I don't want to be a singer, I want to act. And more than that, I want to go to college, I want to study law, I want to find myself and live my life. She was only 14 years old, but shortly after that, Joseph came home with news. He'd signed her to a recording contract with A&M Records. Her first album was called Janet Jackson. She didn't have any input into the creative direction, she just went in and sang the songs that they told her to. The album wasn't necessarily a flop, depending on whose standards you were using. It entered the Billboard charts outside of the top 40, and it sold about 300,000 copies. But for a Jackson, it was a failure. Later that year, her older brother Michael would release the album Thriller. Janet wasn't particularly interested in doing another album, but she had a contract, and again, her dad made her. Her next album, Dream Street, sold even less than her first one. When she was still in high school, she had met this other singer named James DeBarge, and it was her first love. Eventually they got married, but the marriage was not good for her. James was a drug addict, and they were both young, and they were both famous. It was kind of doomed to fail. So after about a year, Janet got the marriage annulled. She had gotten away from her husband, but now it was time to get away from Joseph. That's what she called him, by the way. He insisted his kids call him Joseph and not Dad. Janet was frustrated with her music career failing when she was doing everything that other people told her to do. She started to think if she was going to fail, let her at least fail on her own terms. So finally, in 1985, she fired her father as her manager. Her new manager was an executive at her record label A&M named John McClain. And when John asked her who she wanted to produce her third album, without hesitation, she said Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. She knew them a little bit. She had met them at different awards shows, and she was a huge fan of their music. They had been members of the band The Time, the Minnesota funk band that was associated with Prince. But in 1983, Jimmy and Terry had left the time to start working on producing. And they had had some success with artists like the SOS Band and Climax, but nothing like what they were about to do with Janet. Janet's father, still trying to exert his influence, tried to get Jimmy and Terry to go to Los Angeles to record, but they refused. They said, Janet has to come to us. And so she did. Janet moved to Minneapolis, and that's where she said everything changed. For the first week or so, they didn't even go into the studio. Janet and Jimmy and Terry just got to know each other. It was the summer in Minnesota, so they would go out and hang out outside all day. Then at night, they would go to clubs, and they would just talk. Janet told them about her life, about growing up as a Jackson, about getting away from her husband, about trying to get away from her father. Eventually she said, when are we going to work on the album? And they told her, we are working on the album. They showed her a song that they had written for her called Control. When she read the lyrics, she said, this is everything that we've been talking about. And they said, yeah, we want this album to be a reflection of you and your experiences and your struggles. And Janet was taken aback. Nobody had ever asked her for her ideas before. The collaboration between the three of them starts to result in songs like What Have You Done For Me Lately, The Pleasure Principle, and the song that was written about her catcalling experience, Nasty. But not only did Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis help Janet Jackson tell her own story and find her own voice, the music they were creating for these songs was hugely innovative. The duo were early adopters of the Roland 808 drum machine, a piece of musical equipment that was a commercial failure that went on to revolutionize pop music. Because the drum machine had flopped, it made it very affordable to buy used, and it became the drum machine of choice for hip-hop producers. Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis mixed these influences from hip-hop, from funk, from R&B, from dance pop, and mashed it all together into something that would eventually be known as New Jack Swing. When Joseph Jackson heard the album, he absolutely hated it. He hated the music and the artistic direction and said it would never sell. The album Control was released in February of 1986, and at first it was a slow climb. It debuted on the Billboard charts in March of 1986 at number 84. But before long, it started to pick up momentum. One big reason for this is that Janet Jackson made music videos for 6 of the 7 singles on the album. Music television was hitting its peak in 1986, and Janet soon became one of the biggest artists on the channel. Her music videos, a lot of which were choreographed by a then unknown Paula Abdul, went into regular rotation. Control started selling like crazy, at one point selling 250,000 copies in 1 week, which not only was more than her entire second album, but broke a record for a female artist. The album went to number 1 on the Billboard charts and stayed in the charts for 2 years. The album spawned 7 singles, 5 of which entered the Billboard Top 5, again a record for a female artist. Eventually the album would sell over 10 million copies worldwide. And Janet Jackson, Terry Lewis, and Jimmy Jam continued to work together and have a string of successful collaborations. The follow-up to Control, Rhythm Nation, sold even more copies. Their album after that, 1993's Janet, sold even more. And they continued working together, having multi-platinum albums like The Velvet Rope and All For You. In 2021, for the album's 35th anniversary, Control actually went back onto the charts again. It's an incredibly important and influential album, the breakthrough record of one of the biggest artists of all time. And it all happened because Janet Jackson decided to take control.